All right, my approach to Velikovsky came through the field of literature, which is my own specialization. I teach Shakespeare and Elizabethan drama particularly, and it occurred to me that if Velikovsky is correct, then it must have something to do with art as well as the questions in science. To put it in simplest terms, I think that if Velikovsky is correct and the catastrophes occurred, and if the concept of a racial memory is correct, that we do all possess unconsciously memories of these catastrophes within us, then there must be an effect perceptible in the domain of creative art. Because I think that art is a production of society, that we as a culture, as members of Western culture, produce creative art for our culture. And therefore, if we are traumatized, if we have a racial memory of what Velikovsky said happened, then it must affect art. And my theory is this: these things are too horrible to be remembered directly. Therefore, we have to suppress them out of conscious memory. However, they are too powerful to be kept continuously, safely suppressed. They keep coming up again, and we have to push them down, and they come up, and we have to push them down. So we as a group, as a culture, as Western culture, have to evolve systems which will allow us to live with these memories so that we can function consciously without them interfering with our daily lives. And I think that art is part of the system we have evolved. In other words, in great art, in the most enduring and the most popular art, I think that we have evolved a system whereby we can recall the Velikovskyan events in disguise, and the closer the events in art can come to mirroring the actual events without actually being the same, the more intensely we can remember these events, but we always put it within a happy ending framework. And so we remember safely, we remember indirectly, we remember in disguise. And this allows us to re-forget. This is the function of art. We remember so that we can re-forget. Each time the memory comes up, we can experience the memory vicariously, unconsciously in the form of art, and we can push it down again. So that every culture, every age, every language group must produce its own recreations in art, in disguise, of the events that Velikovsky says occurred. And that is why every age in Western culture produces the same kind of art, the same comedies, the same tragedies, the same mythologies, the same dreams, the same political structures. Art is a mechanism by which we can endure memories which are too horrible to face directly, and it allows us to face these memories in a situation whereby the happy ending makes the remembering safe, so that unconsciously we remember the horrible facts, consciously we are reassured, and art is therefore a collective psychological mechanism which allows us to function in everyday life without having to face these memories directly. Now, I evolved this as a theory of literature, as a theory of art, from Velikovsky. And then, in my book, I perform what we might call a thought experiment, or else an experiment on literature. That is to say, after having stated the theory hypothetically, I then ask myself, can we find traces of this in art which will then tend to confirm the theory? And I looked in Shakespeare, which is my own field, and the result of my discoveries in Shakespeare is my book, Collective Memory and the Springs of Art. The point of the book is to demonstrate, after having stated the theory at the beginning, that the plays of Shakespeare, the examples I have chosen, indicate that there is a subconscious level of action and symbolism and reference in the plays which imitates the Velikovskyan events in such a way that we unconsciously understand what is going on, and we are unconsciously comforted by the experience of a Shakespearean play. And this, to me, explains the deeper dimensions of Shakespeare's almost universal attraction. One of the reasons why he is perhaps the most universal author who has ever written is precisely because he contains, to a greater extent than most other artists who have ever written, the catastrophic elements which we need to experience in order to re-forget them. This is what I think is going on in Shakespeare, and I use Shakespeare as a confirmation of my theory of literature, which is based upon Velikovsky's theory of catastrophism. Now, if you look at the history of Western ideas in a very broad perspective, and I'm thinking of it in very, very general sweeping terms, which might sound like an overgeneralization, but I think it's appropriate and I think it's true. We find that the basic beliefs of Western history, of Western ideas, are predicated upon the need on our part to be convinced that the world is safe. And I think that all the currents, the general large currents of Western intellectual thought, can be explained and identified and connected on that basis. That is to say, if we look at Aristotle, for whom I don't really have very much respect, I think that Aristotle, in his desire to pigeonhole and organize knowledge in the optics and the physics and the poetics and so on, is trying to give us the impression that knowledge is compartmentalizable, that the world can be understood by man, and that man can control the physical world. And I think he's doing this as a reaction to the catastrophes which occurred or which terminated not long before he flourished. Now, if Greek thought is predicated upon the idea that man can both understand and therefore predict and therefore control the universe, Christianity, which begins at the year zero, shall we say, but doesn't really become a major force in the Western world until 300 or 400 AD, Christianity begins as a religion which says, don't concern yourself with this world, we want you to understand the next. However, by about 1200, Christianity has become a philosophy for this world as well as a religion for the next. It has become the medieval science, the medieval cosmology. And if you look at medieval Christianity in its most unlikely marriage with Aristotle and people like Ptolemy, you then find that the Christian science contained in Christian theology of the Middle Ages tells us that the world is safe because God keeps it safe. It therefore argues that we need not concern ourselves about the world because God is in control. When the astronomical revolution initiated by people like Copernicus and Galileo had a sizable effect upon Western thinking, this removed man's confidence in God. And therefore the Western world needed a new source of confidence, which was given to it by Newton. That is to say, Newton's depiction of a clockwork universe, which has been wound up by God, presumably. He may not be here now checking on it. Maybe he has other universes or other clocks to wind up. But the world will run like a perfect clock, and gravitation replaces God as the basis for certainty in the stability of the universe. The entire universe is connected by gravity. It is a perfect clock. Nothing has ever gone wrong from the moment of creation, and nothing ever will go wrong. So, the Newtonian clockwork universe is designed to create within us the feeling, or shall I say the illusion, of cosmic stability, in the same way that medieval Christianity's emphasis upon a God-centered world was, and in the same way that Aristotle's emphasis upon the logic of man and his concept that things are eternal and never change was. Now, we can see then that the main intention of Western thought from 500 BC to 2000 or 1900 AD all has the same intent. It is a collective, neurotic reaction on the part of Western culture to provide ourselves with a system of thought which makes us believe that the world is stable because we refuse to acknowledge that the world can be unstable. The East acknowledges it, and therefore the East has had no reason to produce the kind of systems of thought and the kind of endeavors like science and art that we produce. We must do it because we refuse to acknowledge the possibility of catastrophism, and therefore everything we do is a hysterical desire to put this thought out of our mind. Now in the 20th century, with the advent of relativism in physics and various kinds of revolt in philosophy and a whole attempt at destruction of the solidity of feeling in music, in painting, in art, in literature, and in drama, we are in a period of crisis where a new synthesis has not emerged. But when it will emerge, I think I can predict with some degree of confidence that its intention will be the same. Whatever synthesis emerges out of the destruction of ideas in the 20th century, it'll emerge in the next century, that synthesis will have the same purpose. It will provide us with a feeling that the Earth is stable and safe. Now, I'm not using Einstein's name merely to give some kind of spurious or cheap credibility to Velikovsky. That's not the point. I think what must be understood is that they engaged in a serious, rational, civilized debate about the electromagnetic properties of the universe. At the time, Velikovsky said certain things existed which Einstein doubted. After a time when certain things appeared, notably the electromagnetic magnetosphere of Jupiter, Einstein became more convinced that Velikovsky might be correct. And I think that the discussion between them centered about the possibility of whether or not Velikovsky's argument about catastrophism had a basis in the structure of the cosmos. And it would appear that towards the end of his life, Einstein had developed at least a tolerant attitude towards what Velikovsky said. And had he lived longer, there is the feeling that he might have been able to arrange for certain experiments which would have verified or not verified the basic hypotheses which are central to Velikovsky's argument. I think that is the nature of the discussion between them, that Einstein took Velikovsky seriously, looked at his propositions seriously, and kept an open mind about what Velikovsky was saying. This is the extent of the relationship between them. I think that is the important thing to understand. Have a look at the scenery behind me and ask yourself if this could have occurred peacefully and slowly over a couple of billion years, or do you think it happened all at once?